Welcome to our session. My name is Sam Libby. This is Nick. How do you say your last name, Nick?
Brueggemann.
Brueggemann.
I always know when people are trying to get a hold of me that I don't know.
Yeah. We both work for Esri Professional Services. I personally work in the Denver office. I spent about 6 years in DC before moving out there a year and a half ago. And I focus on portal and server and ArcGIS Enterprise deployments across different types of customers, from state and local to federal government to big commercial companies. Do quite a bit of work with security and kind of IT integration, and some of those topics we'll talk through today.
And I'm Nick Brueggemann. I'm in the St. Louis regional office. I've only been actually with Esri for about 8 months. Up until then, I was like you guys. I came here as a customer of Esri, so it's a little bit different being on this side, but I think I can help offer a perspective that's kind of in line with what you guys are experiencing. So I'm going to dive into a lot of the development topics today and kind of talk about, in the trench development stuff.
So we're going to go over a couple different topics. This presentation has been given a couple years in a row now at Dev Summit. It's been pretty popular. We tried to update a few things. I added a few demos. And what we're trying to talk about really is using Web AppBuilder at scale on both sides of the kind of development pattern. So first off, how do you deploy Web AppBuilder in a way that it's usable by multiple developers across your organization, that takes advantage of multiple assets that you have in different places, different base maps, different portal configurations you can reuse, but also how you deploy it once you've built out your apps afterwards, which Nick will talk about some more, and how do you do development in a way that's sustainable and replicable across multiple apps. I'll go through some basic stuff about install and config that's important at the enterprise level. I'm sure many people here know that very well, but it's important to recall a few important components of it. Talk about how to securely configure Web AppBuilder with updating certificates, and I'll do a demonstration of that in a way to save you some time and save users from some problems. Talk about development, and then some deployment and post-deployment components. And anybody, feel free to take pictures of the slides. I'm also happy to give you a copy of the slides if you want to give me a business card at the end if you want to save your camera space. Or this stuff will all be posted online after Dev Summit as well with the recording, so definitely feel free. So what do we really mean by enterprise deployment of Web AppBuilder? We talk about Enterprise GIS as a system that allows everybody in the organization to discover geospatial content, create and use maps, and share information. In a lot of cases, that means that they all have access to view an app that you as a developer might put together and put out on a web server. But I think it's also important to allow multiple developers across the organization to collaborate and both save time on developing shared code, but also be able to create lots of separate apps and do so in a way that's able to be supported by a larger team. It also means integrating with your enterprise security best practices. A lot of us just get to run all of our software on our laptop, which is all well and good, but when you have to deploy portal and server, but also Web AppBuilder to a large organization, you may have rules you have to follow and IT guidelines to keep track of. We have two basic implementation patterns for Web AppBuilder and really for Enterprise GIS in general. We talk a lot about ArcGIS Online being a software as a service offering. The benefits there, as you all know, is lack of maintenance requirements for the software, updates. It's a multi-tenant environment where we control the SLA. And then now, as we now call it, ArcGIS Enterprise on premises, which often is used in disconnected networks, which Nick will talk about a little bit, and also supports things like enterprise groups and additional configuration and customization beyond what you can do through the online interface. You want to change things about the way portal looks or turn things on and off, as we'll show an example of later. You can do that all in portal. But of course, it's up to you to control the SLA for that. We also have two different ways of deploying Web AppBuilder. The first is not really something that you deploy. It's what we call the embedded edition, or the embedded version. And this is something that's fully integrated within Portal or Online, where you just open up Web AppBuilder and it's part of the actual web app that Portal or Online gives you. You don't have to have your own web server. It fits in with the user workflow. You can now share maps right to there from the map viewer. But you also can't change things about that and develop actively against that deployment. The developer edition is what's obviously required for building custom components and different widgets on top of that. You can do themes and changes to existing widgets, or build your own from scratch, or use lots from the community that we have on GeoNet and beyond. You also have direct access to that. There's no need to start from a web map and share into it. Both of these support different authentication patterns, different user deployment models, all kinds of different things, but the key difference is whether you have to deploy on a server somewhere or make use of a server that already has it built in. In terms of what we find to be most common with large enterprise customers, I think it's fair to say now that the majority of our customers working in their own environments are deploying Portal for ArcGIS, and a lot of them are using the Dev Edition with that. Both that and the ArcGIS Online deployment with Dev Edition are the most common developer-friendly ways of using this software. It's becoming less and less common to only work with the embedded edition, and we've seen really everything across the board through here, but it's becoming clear that people want to use Dev Edition with Portal and do so frequently, so we're trying to show some ways you can very easily integrate that. Most of our presentation here is going to focus on the Dev Edition because that's where most of you work. It's where developers play a large role, but a lot of this stuff also applies to the online version. So obviously we have a lot of really good documentation that you've all seen about getting Web AppBuilder up and running on your own environment or on a server that's going to host it long term. I want to highlight a few things that you're going to see throughout that process and you might run into in an enterprise installation. The first one is the option of configuring a local JS API reference. So if you're in an environment where you don't have internet, or you're on a server that may be in a lockdown environment, like some DMZ servers might be, you may want to deploy a version of the JavaScript API for your own use. This allows you to have the app entirely local. There's no calls out to the internet whatsoever. By default, we point to our own CDN, which is nice and fast, but if you're either disconnected or, for example, working offline on an airplane, you don't have internet, you may want to have your local copy of the JS API. You do that through the client folder in the STEM app and the env.js file. It's easy to see there, just one line of change, and as long as you have that downloaded from the developer site, you can go ahead and use that. One warning is to make sure that you know what version of our JS API the Dev Edition is expecting to see. Every time we release new software, over the course of the year, we're always releasing new versions of the JS API, as you all know. The current Dev Edition expects version 3.19, so if you have an earlier version, you might get some inconsistencies there. Also remember that if you're working in a totally disconnected environment, you'll have to supply all your own base maps and map services as well. So while you might be able to do some basic development of the UI or different functionality, unless you have your own base maps or your own services, you're not going to see any stuff on the map. Luckily, most people who are working in disconnected environments, all of that runs through Portal. So if they already have their base maps and services configured in Portal, they'll just get that inherited into Web AppBuilder automatically. It's kind of one of the reasons we have it connected to Portal for that use case. There's a couple different ways that you can run Web AppBuilder. You can run it simply from startup.bat, obviously, and that runs a command window and launches a browser for you. You can run it manually from your command line with a node call to server.js. You can also run it as a Windows service and have that running something you can start and stop automatically or have deployed as part of your own policies. Let me see if I can get my screen right. So I've gone ahead and actually put together a shortcut here that runs Web AppBuilder from my taskbar, and I can click this right here and open up the interface and launch it into Web AppBuilder right from my taskbar. So if you're sick of going into command just to type startup.bat, it's very easy to build a shortcut and move it over here, so you have a one-click access to go view your app. As you do the install after deploying the files, you're going to have to register it with your portal. This is a pretty straightforward process that we go through the My Content page and add it with a OAuth app secret. One thing I'll add here is that, let me switch my display. One thing I'll add here is that this interface has just changed. I tried to provide some new screenshots. It's basically the same process. You'll see on the right some info about the registration for the app, and then I've added the 3 different URL patterns here that I might use to access Web AppBuilder. If you try to log into Web AppBuilder using a different host name than you originally registered it with, you're not going to get allowed to through OAuth. So make sure that when you register it for the first time, you add both your fully qualified domain name, your local host name, and then also localhost with the port number here as well. That'll make sure that whatever access you use to get to Web AppBuilder, it's going to allow you to log in that way. This is also important if you're ever deploying to a different remote web server that you don't use your own name, obviously, but use any names users might find to get to there. The first time that you open up a Web AppBuilder, it's going to ask for the app ID. You'll notice that if your portal's using integrated Windows authentication, it's not going to do much for you because OAuth doesn't work through that process. So in the configuration here, in the signinfo.json, you can see the isWebTier parameter, which you can turn to true if you use Windows Auth, which is quite common in enterprise deployments where you want to have single sign-on. What that means is that you will no longer need the app ID, which is nice. You need to make sure that if you ever switch to using online or a different portal that's not IWA enabled, that you switch that back to false. The app ID here, if you ever need to change it, can be edited manually, or you can just kind of reinstall Web AppBuilder in a different folder and start up from scratch and try from there. It's also good once you register the application and have it in a kind of a dedicated location, you can share that with your organization through the featured maps and apps on your homepage or through the templates gallery in your custom templates group. This allows you to basically allow users to find Web AppBuilder if they don't know it's already deployed, and it's maybe a good thing or a bad thing to give them access to play with it. But you want to give them the option of being able to use it, develop some apps, doesn't cost anything to have more apps deployed, and lets them kind of enjoy the benefits of that and maybe even get some development under their belt. You can also go ahead and, once you have the developer edition, disable the embedded version. What this will do is remove that second tab on the right side you can see. This will allow users to only use either the built-in templates or Web AppBuilder templates that you create yourself. So as you develop your own apps and customize widgets and change things around, you can reshare those deployed apps out as templates and allow users to use that instead of the built-in version. We added this because people were often asking whether we could disable it rather than always having that as an option. And it allows you to share only to those apps that you as an administrator or as a developer want the users to use. This is also important because obviously the embedded version doesn't support custom widgets or custom themes. So if you want to have a custom theme for all your Web AppBuilder apps and you have a centralized builder running on a server somewhere, you can now point people to that and disable the built-in one, especially if they're going to be public facing and you want to have a nice theme. That can be important. This is done through the config.js file or config.json file inside of the Portal install directory. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here that you can do with Portal, a lot of true-false things I encourage you to explore. All this is all documented in the Portal administration guides, but the key one in blue there is that you can disable the Web AppBuilder through that setting. All these things do require a restart of Portal to take effect, so definitely do that during some downtime. But this might take a minute or two, and then you've basically got this functionality disabled. I want to talk a little bit about HTTPS and SSL certificates. We're going to have a blog post coming out about this in the next couple weeks, but I'm going to do a demonstration of how to replace the built-in certificate that the Web AppBuilder ships with one from your domain certificate authority. It's really important to use Web AppBuilder with valid HTTPS and SSL certificates for a couple different reasons. Obviously, we ship it with a self-signed cert, which is fine. It's very functional, but it's not really ideal for your enterprise users, and in most environments where IT is taking a close look at what you're doing, it's definitely against the rules to be using a self-signed cert. It's very easy to spoof, very easy to cause some security problems there. It also helps because users get confused when they see these big dialogues in our browser saying, don't go to this place, this is a dangerous website, when they think they're going to Web AppBuilder. You can always use your own certificate authority and replace the default one. We do have some guidance on the website for that. I'm going to do a little more in-depth demo of how to do that that you're welcome to ask me about later. But the key thing is you can use either a domain certificate authority or a commercial CA. We at Esri have a domain CA, which I'll be demonstrating, but you can get VeriSign or DigiCert or anybody else to sign that as well. What you'll need to get it to work with Web AppBuilder is a server certificate and a key pair. The reason we need that is that Node runs off of a private key and a public key, and we need to have both of those available to the app to be able to make that secure connection. To do it, we're going to need to create some PEM files. We're going to show converting a PFX certificate into a key pair, and then how to replace those on the server and restart Web AppBuilder to make sure it looks all nice and green and happy. So if I pull up my browser here, you'll see when I launched Web AppBuilder before that I get this nice dialog. Now, every month it seems like Chrome is making it harder and harder to accept insecure websites. So you'll actually see now, because I've been testing around with this, Chrome remembers that I once came to this site with a valid certificate, and I can't even go to my Web AppBuilder site right now because in its memory it's saying this is now a different cert than you used to have. So this is why I want to have a valid one in there to always avoid this ever happening. If I go to the dev tools and look at the actual certificate, you'll see they also removed that option from here, you may have noticed. I've got an invalid self-signed certificate here that just says localhost, localhost. Sure, it's valid for 10 years from the date it was created. That's fine for 10 years, but I want to make my own and replace this with a valid one. If I don't have a commercial CA, I can actually do that for free from my own domain. I'm on VPN right now into my own network, so I can get on my domain-controlled CA and actually replace that. So I'm going to open up the Microsoft Management Console, go to File, add the certificate snap-in, and when I do this, it's going to ask me who I want to do this snap-in for. I'm going to choose the computer account rather than my user account, and then choose local computer and finish. When I add that, I'm going to get a listing of all the certificates in the local computer certificate store. If I go into personal, I'll see a couple certs that I've already created here before this demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and right-click and say All Tasks, Request New Certificate. This is, again, somewhat unique to our network. A lot of people have this, but not everybody has this option, in that we have an Active Directory enrollment policy at Esri that lets me cut my own certificates that are trusted by our own computers. I have all kinds of different options of what kind of cert to create, and I'm going to go ahead and create a web server SHA-256 certificate here. It's going to ask me to add some additional information about that certificate before I can create it. And what I'm going to do here is enter in a common name for my machine. But along with that, I'm also going to do some alternative names under DNS entries. I need to have the same as my original name. I'm also going to add just my short host name here as well. These are what are called subject alternate names in a certificate, so you'll often see certs that have multiple websites that they're allowed to be used for. This is going to allow me to use either my short name or my long name for the cert when I actually get it embedded in Web AppBuilder. I'm going to go ahead and give that a friendly name. And now I'm going to go ahead and enroll. This is actually not going to work over my VPN. It's going to fail, but I already created it when I was back in the office. What that gives me is in my IIS management console, I'll have a new server certificate here, which if I open it, you can see has both my issued name for my host name as well as our enterprise root as the CA. And if I go to the details, and I wait for my thing to fail, go to the details and scroll down, I can see subject alternative name and see both those host names listed. This is something one of my colleagues showed me a few months ago that I thought was pretty interesting because we're often testing certificates on our own and is very, very useful if you have your own CA. You'll also notice here from IIS that I can't actually export this certificate. I'm going to have to do that back from the MMC console. I'll take one that I already created and go to export. I'm going to export the private key with it, which is very important. Leave the default here for how it's going to be encoded. Give it a password and save that file. What you'll see when that finishes is I now have a PFX file in my folder here. If I open that up, I can view it and import it if I need to. I already have that. What this contains is both the combination of that public key and private key together. Now there's two different ways you can actually use to generate a PEM file from this, or the two PEM files that we need to have. The first, and I'll do that as it's my preference, is to use a tool called Keystore Explorer. This is a free open source tool available online that basically lets you work with Java key stores or different kinds of encoded security and certificate key stores. I'm going to open up that PFX file, enter in the password, and you'll actually see my single certificate there with information about it. If I look at that file, I can see that it has my enterprise root as well as my actual common name of my machine there. I'm going to do two different export methods here to give me my public and my private key. For the public key, I'm going to export the certificate chain, choose head only and X509 with PEM encoding. I'm just going to change that file to cacert.pem. One click, all good. I can also right click here and export my private key. It'll ask me for my password again. I'm going to choose an OpenSSL format for that file, choose not to encrypt it. So I'm not going to have a password on that private key anymore, and then choose this as cakey.pem. Now when I create those files, what you end up seeing is basically a bunch of PEM encoded text here. This is nothing especially useful to you, but it can be decrypted by the server to show a certificate or certificate chain. You can also, of course, do this with OpenSSL. I've got the different command line prompts here just to show you guys I can do command line as well. Somebody told me, if I go back to my presentation for a second, that if I didn't do this in command line, I would not maintain my credibility at Dev Summit. So I want to show that I can definitely do that. So I'm going to go to my folder here and use my new PFX file. And then paste in the rest of my command. It's going to ask me for my password again. Going to export that as Esri assert.pem. The same command with -nodes will give you my private key. If I use the right one. Okay, and now I've got those additional two files here, Esri assert.pem and key.pem. These are slightly different. The actually key includes a little more information in it. I'm not really sure what the difference is, but they both work perfectly well with Web AppBuilder. I'm going to take these two original files that I generated, go to my Web AppBuilder deployment location, and in the server folder you'll see the CA key and CA cert files that we ship with the software. I'm going to stop my running process, take those two files and move them, and then paste in my new ones. These files now will be used the same alias, same name, and if I run Web AppBuilder, you'll see it'll start up the same way. Same information here. And when this opens up, you'll now see that I have a valid, I hope. Let's try that again. There we go. So now you see I have a valid lock sign here. If I look at my certificate, I have my newly cut certificate. Signed by my domain CA here, just like a commercial CA. And I can also now, if I just happen to type in only slibby10, use my local host name and still get a green lock as well. So that's really helpful if you prefer to use local host name or your shortcuts point there. Oftentimes, it's impossible to get a certificate for both, but through that method with MMC, you can get one that covers both of those examples. Now that might have been extremely boring for many people, but something that I do a lot on site is deal with certificates, and it's also, like I said, really important for users to appreciate that you're doing things right and that you have a valid, secure environment. So again, we basically generated a cert with the Microsoft Management Console with a SAN and two different names, exported it from the web server, converted it with the PEM encoding with Keystore Explorer, OpenSSL, and I'm happy to share those steps in that command line code if you prefer. Let's switch over to Nick now to talk a little bit more about development, and then I'll come back to talk about post-deployment.
Hey, thanks, Sam. We wanted to spend a little bit of time and talk about some of the real-world development scenarios you find yourself in when you're developing with Web AppBuilder. I'm a developer. It's what I do all day long. So I find myself, like I said, in the trenches doing this kind of stuff all the time. There's basically three topics I want to talk about today with Web AppBuilder, and it's kind of how we deal with some of these scenarios. The first one is a little bit straightforward. It's kind of how to manage your source code and set up your workflow with Web AppBuilder. The second one gets into a topic I deal with all the time, and it's extending and customizing the out-of-the-box Web AppBuilder widgets. The Web AppBuilder team does a really good job of making sure that those widgets out of the box cover a lot of the functionality, but it seems inevitable that we'll have a customer that wants something special constantly. And then the third topic is kind of what happens when your application is going beyond just widgets. You know, as we talk about Web AppBuilder, it's all widget, widget, widget. Well, lots of times we find ourselves in a scenario where the application has grown big enough to where the code is really kind of beyond widgets. So we've got some tips and tricks on how to deal with that as well. So starting off, we highly encourage that you keep your custom source code managed separately than Web AppBuilder. You download the Web AppBuilder Development Edition, install it on your PC. There is no need for you to configuration manage or source version control Web AppBuilder itself. So on the left here, we've got your repository that has your custom code, including any custom themes you have, any custom widgets, any of that stuff. And then there's STEM app, which is Web AppBuilder. We use grunt or gulp typically to inject our code out of our repository into STEM app. And then finally, when you actually go to build an application with Web AppBuilder, it pulls its state from STEM app and creates the apps folder. That's kind of how that whole configuration works with Web AppBuilder. So if you look, I've got a repository here in GitLab or GitHub. And all I have is my source code directory. I've got a git ignore file. And in that git ignore file, I am ignoring Web AppBuilder, which is where I deploy my Web AppBuilder Developer Edition. And I've also got a node modules folder. I ignore that as well. So really the only thing that is in this repository is my code. My widgets are here. I don't have any themes in this, but that's where they would go as well. And we'll get into what this lib stuff is in a minute. So if you're not familiar with grunt or gulp, they are node packages. And these are, they help automate your workflow. They're both kind of synonymous. Gulp and grunt do basically the same thing. This week I like grunt or gulp better than grunt. I go back and forth all the time. But basically you can go download this gulp package and there's other gulp modules that are in there. One of the ones we use is called watch. So if you look at the source code we have here, this is a gulp task. And I've got it set up to point to my Web AppBuilder's STEM app directory. This is where I'm going to deploy my code. And it's watching my source code folder. So anytime I make any changes to my source code, Gulp is going to notice that, and it's going to take those changes and copy them over to STEM app. So that kind of helps automate that development workflow. You're not having to deal with an app configuration. You're not having to deal with constantly moving files around manually on your file system. This automates some of that. So that's what this workflow is. Another thing that we do a lot is dealing with these apps that get generated. Sometimes when you're developing a widget from scratch, you're not ready to deploy that into an application at all. You just want to develop your widget and then get that to a stable state. And once it's in a stable state, then you'll worry about putting it into an application. There's a configuration or a kind of a trick that we can do with a URL parameter where we can develop directly against STEM app itself. So if you look at what I'm doing here, with this application, the URL is pointed at STEM app, and I'm passing in a config parameter. And in that config parameter, I have given it a custom configuration. This configuration is that base configuration that's sitting in the STEM app folder. I've just manually added my widget to it so I can develop against it, again, without having to deal with any of the kind of the craziness with creating an application in Web AppBuilder. This is an example of what I've done to that configuration. Likely I hijacked something that was already in that config and just replaced the URI to my custom widget and then a label for it. So it's pretty straightforward to do that. And again, here's that URL. You can have multiple config files in your repository. Just change out which one you're referencing and you can load up different widgets as you're developing them.
Yeah, we've used this for development, test, and production environments too.
Right.
We might have different configurations for widgets and have just basically all you deploy is 3 JSON files.
Yep.
And that makes it a lot easier to both send deployments over email or even just get them on the server itself.
Right, absolutely. Another topic I deal with constantly is extending Web AppBuilder widgets. Literally with the project that I'm working on now, we have customized the attribute table widget, we've customized the layerless widget, we've customized the search widget, the geoprocessing widget. It just never seems to end. The customer that we have is always coming up with other great ideas that they want to add. So there are options that you have when extending these out-of-the-box Web AppBuilder widgets. The first option is pretty straightforward. You can just take the code that's in Web AppBuilder and start modifying it. If you look at what's in STEM app that comes with the developer edition of Web AppBuilder, you have access to that code. It's not minified, it's all sitting right there. Let me hop over to that. So here is the Web App Builder, and here's STEM App. Here's all the widgets that are in STEM App. If you need to look at how these are developed or want to see how they're done, you can dive in there and do that. And again, you have access to that code, so you can start digging through here, look at some of the methods that are implemented, and if you want to change them, you can change that code. I highly recommend that if you change this code, at that point, take the widget code that's in here and put that in your source control. Because at that point in time, once you've customized the Web App Builder widget, it's really kind of your widget now too. And you want to keep those changes out of the STEM app folder. You want to pull those into your source code directory. Another method that we like to do, because if you start modifying the Web App Builder code itself, upgrading to the next version of Web App Builder can be a challenge. You know, now you've got your version of the widget, you've got the new version of the Web App Builder widget. You have to be able to take the changes that you've made and then merge them back into the upgraded version of Web App Builder of that widget. So an alternative way to extend the out-of-the-box widgets is to truly extend that widget. We've done this with the search widget. Our customer wanted us to add in additional options for searching on specific coordinates, MGRS coordinates, UTM coordinates. They also wanted a help section on there because I guess their users didn't quite understand the format of UTM and MGRS, so they wanted us to put a help section out there. They also wanted a green dot to show up on the map when that coordinate was found. So the way we did that was we subclassed the search widget that was the out of the box. So if we look over at that code, I can show you how we did that. We've got right here is the out of the box search widget. We reference it as the parent widget. And then this, we call this our enhanced, I think I called it enhanced, search enhanced. So when you look down here, when we define this class, we use that parent widget as the base class. And then we start overriding methods in the out of the box search widget. So if we look up here, we'll have a customized widget method. This will go through and add that custom functionality that we want to add. This is a little bit better than just kind of going into the out-of-the-box widget and hacking at it, and putting your changes everywhere. And the upgrade path for this will be better as long as any of the methods that you're extending and overriding don't change, which that can happen too. And if that happens, you're just going to have to look at the new version of the Web App Builder widget and try to figure out how to apply your changes to it, or don't upgrade that widget anymore. And it really depends, and there's not a silver bullet to this stuff. It really kind of depends on the changes that you need to make to those widgets as to which one is the more appropriate solution. When we extended the search widget, it was pretty straightforward where we were adding that functionality. But when I extended the layer list, there's a bunch of different classes in the layer list that comprise that widget. So it was a lot more difficult to try to figure out how to get our changes just kind of poked in there. So that was one where we just kind of took the out-of-the-box widget and we owned it at that point. So this is kind of what the search enhanced widget looked like. We added that help to it. We extended the search widget, made that the base class of the search enhanced, and that's how we implemented that. Finally, we run into this a lot where, again, you tend to think about Web App Builder as just widgets. Lots of times as your application grows, you really kind of teeter on that line of, well, we're using Web App Builder, but we're really making almost a custom application now. And then lots of times there's code that you need to share between widgets. The widgets don't really just live on their own. So Web App Builder also has another area where you can put logic like this. It's called libs. And if you look here in my source code folder, I have a libs directory. We called it custom. And in this are a bunch of classes. I've got some utility classes, basic math utilities, just kind of, real low level functionality. The search widget uses this coordinate conversion utilities class. That one will take a text string and then a text string as a coordinate and parse it into geometry. And we have, in our project, there are multiple widgets that are doing this. So that's why we house this stuff in libs. So each widget doesn't have a duplicate copy of that code. And this is all set up like the rest of the code. Gulp is watching this libs folder, and when this stuff changes, it will inject that stuff into Web AppBuilder. It's easy to think of Web AppBuilder as just a series of widgets, but your application can absolutely grow beyond the scope of just the widgets, for sure. And we run into that a lot of times. You do have to be careful though, of course, because when that happens, you can't just pick up a widget by itself and share it. You have to pick up that widget and the libs directory as well, because it depends on that stuff too. So that's all I have on the custom development stuff. Like I said, that's things that we run into a lot. So you guys are not alone.
And we'll have some pitches for the upcoming sessions this afternoon that go into a lot deeper dive into that development side of things. To finish up with some talk about deployment and managing your apps after deployment, now that you, as a developer, have an app, what do you do with that? A lot of times you're trying to get this out to as many people as possible, maybe doing some beta releases, maybe showing it off to your executives, whatever's necessary. In the embedded version, that's very easy. There's no deployment needed. When you create a Web AppBuilder app with the embedded edition, it actually is saving all that app config just as a JSON file through the sharing API in our portal. There's no deployment. It's already in the web server. It's handed out through your web adapter. That's as easy as it gets. Another way you can handle using Dev Edition to create web apps is to use the apps that you've created as a template back in your portal. What this means is that allows users to basically build a web map in the map viewer in the portal, generate a web app through that actually goes through your customized code from the Dev Edition. That means you can give people access to play with your widgets, try things out with their own data, their own layers. That's where it's really important to set up your widgets, if you are building custom widgets, to have nice configuration experiences, because users might be doing their own configuration against their own layers. That's where we've had a lot of success with customizing the individual existing widgets to tweak them. For a user, it looks mostly the same, but they have a little more functionality in some areas that's really useful to their business case. With Dev Edition also, you can obviously export an app and take that and deploy it on your own web server. This is often what happens with finished products after we're done with them. We may have multiple releases where maybe we develop for a month or a sprint of an iteration of some kind, deploy it to a web server in development every day, but also put it out for the public once a month. It fits well within a lot of existing enterprise frameworks. The basic steps to go through that is that the app author or developer is going to download that app and then provide it to a sysadmin to deploy it to a server. You may then have to go back and register the app yourself with either your portal or ArcGIS Online to allow them to actually access secured content and give it that OAuth app ID, and then potentially reconfigure on top of that. And all of this can be fit into existing deployment workflows as well. So you may work somewhere where they have a big TFS system where they do builds of other custom apps. You can fit your code into that and have it be built out as part of that and deployed to a server for development or to production. You can do semantic versioning with your apps. You can do release notes, everything you want to do to fit into your existing enterprise requirements. If you're at an org that leverages Web AppBuilder Developer Edition at a broader enterprise level, it's definitely critical to have this workflow figured out and to work with the IT teams and your sysadmins to figure out what works well for them. After you've done that, I have a little section about proxies. We use proxies really throughout the ArcGIS platform in a bunch of different places. With Web AppBuilder, there's a couple of really important examples of why that's included with our developer tools. One is providing access to cross-domain resources. A lot of public-facing web servers will restrict cross-domain access. It's becoming less and less common as core support has grown over the past, well, probably decade now, but it used to be very common that you'd have to have a proxy if you wanted to access services from a separate app server. You can also, through the resource proxy, embed credentials and access secured services through your application without providing that login to your users. So let's say you want to have an app based on your own routing service, but you don't want to expose that to the world. You can provide access to that through the proxy to the users of that app, and then only make sure they're using it through that one interface. The proxy allows you to do rate limiting and referrer limiting, both of which are very useful if you have secure content that you want to make sure it's only available through one or more applications. This lets you limit how many requests get sent to your geocode server or your routing server, or a map service, as well as limit which referrers are allowed to send requests to that app or to that service. This is kind of a cool thing you can do in that you can have a single application where you might allow editing of features, for example, and that service is not editable anywhere else in your portal. Because you have an embedded credential there and you're limiting the refer to only that app, you can limit the functionality as well. The proxy also uses the OAuth 2 app login pattern, so you can access secured content and online and premium content, things like our premium services or routing and geocoding through the application. Another proxy use case that's not the resource proxy but is often used is that you can use something like an existing web server like Apache to reverse proxy access to the developer edition. So you may want to have everything that you run hosted through one web server, maps.esri.com, and you have /portal, you have /server, and you have /Web AppBuilder. It looks to the user like they're all in the same system, but you're actually viewing the developer edition on a separate server or running behind the firewall. That can all be done through reverse proxy rules in Apache. The resource proxy is on GitHub. It's really 3 different applications that have the same configuration steps. We have versions for Java web servers, for .NET, and for PHP. This is generally deployed to the same web server as your app itself, so it's on the same domain and the same host name. These are all on GitHub. You can get the best version for your deployment environment and use that. Examples of the config for Web AppBuilder to make use of that proxy is just to put these rules in here for which servers get proxied through that. And this would allow you to say, and basically any services on this server need to go through the proxy where I might have either that rate limiting or a embedded username and password or an OAuth app ID. That allows you to kind of control which services are proxied versus proxying everything, which would obviously overwhelm your web server if you did it all too much. And this is an example of how you can use that OAuth 2 app login pattern to access a secured web map. To finish up, we got a pitch for the next 3 sessions here in the same room. This is kind of our Web AppBuilder themed room here. A kind of further dive into development as we go on during the day, starting with some customizing and extending, a lot more code there, a focus session on 3D apps at 4 o'clock, and then another colleague of mine from the DC office is going to be presenting on advanced development tools and techniques at 5:30. Which I think is a really great presentation that dives farther into kind of the grunt and gulp side of things that Nick talked about. You can get really tricky with your deployment tooling and even be automatically deploying custom widgets to multiple apps, all kinds of different things, if you have a fairly advanced environment. So I want to say thanks, and then also definitely take a bunch of questions from you guys. I'm sure people have lots of questions. This is a session that could go any different directions, so if there's something we didn't cover you want to talk about, we're happy to try. I just ask that you kind of jump up, raise your hand, and speak up so people can hear you. And yeah, we have half an hour or so if you want to ask questions. So either come up afterwards or happy to take some right now if people have them to share with everybody else.
You talked about building the output.
Oh, like a Dojo build for that? Yeah.
Yeah, so the notification.
Yep.
We actually, with what we're doing right now, we're not minifying it. We're not to that point in the development process. One thing I didn't mention though was unit tests. We do throw unit tests in there, and that's all kind of built into that framework that we have with gulp and grunt. So we've got the unit tests that get done, and then if we wanted to do the minification, we would pop that in as another gulp task during a build command.
I know for a fact that George is covering that at the 5:30 session at the end. So there's a bunch of stuff about build processes and some custom tasks that he's written that are covered in that.
Yep.
Anybody else?
So since Web AppBuilder apps obviously are tied to online or portal, and with the seeing shift to making offline available through map packages and short treaties, is there a workflow or a path for widgets in Web AppBuilder and apps in Web AppBuilder to use map packages for offline access for like hidden home screen apps and things like that?
Yeah, good question. A couple of answers I can think of. I don't know if there's anything specifically in the roadmap right now as a first answer. But what I can say is that through some of the things that Nick showed on building libs in your modules, there's 2 different things out there that might make sense. One, you can certainly use feature collections offline if you have relatively simple features that your widgets could pull from and that your web map could actually include a reference to that local location. So you could bake that web map in offline and set up your main STEM app to use an offline web map. There's also a tool that Andy Gup from our dev team, or our developer relations team, has built that lets you use a tile package as a subclass of the tile map surface layer. So that'd be a way that you could basically subclass the app to say, instead of looking for base maps, you use this tile package I have on the device itself. So I think with a combination of kind of aggressively editing the main core functionality of building from the web map, you could still have access to almost all the widgets without editing them directly. Good question, though.
So as far as, you mentioned kind of the logic of libs, and obviously there was examples of helper methods, but what about state?
Absolutely.
Or sharing information literally between widgets and them sharing the same data?
Absolutely. I really look at, when you get into the bigger applications, like I said, you're kind of teetering on that Web AppBuilder versus custom application thing. And Web AppBuilder does provide a ton of functionality, so you want to kind of build within that. I look at it as you're building an application where you've got the widgets at the front end, and then libs kind of really acts as another API layer in there where you put all of your application logic, being your state, being the communication between the widgets at a low level. We've got widgets that the workflow with the application, all the widgets kind of work together. So they are absolutely doing that. The widgets will call into the application logic and set some state, and then that application logic will fire events out and let everybody else know about it. So I think that's really kind of a good way to walk that line between custom application and Web AppBuilder. And then I didn't really get into it much, but a lot of even the custom UI stuff that we do, we put that into libs as well, keeping that out of Web AppBuilder. And what that lets us do is if we ever wanted to make that jump and say, okay, you know what, we are so big it doesn't make sense for us to be in Web AppBuilder anymore, we're going to go totally custom, we've got all that stuff outside of what the Web AppBuilder framework that we can do that easily. So yeah, it's interesting because like I said, when you think of Web AppBuilder, everybody's thinking widgets. And really for us, we end up in those scenarios all the time where it's way more than just widgets. So that's why we highly use that libs directory to kind of manage that application logic and the state.
Yep.
I want to know how we can work with shared environment, like we download the developer's budget, we created widgets, and created an application, downloaded the application, posted it on our server. Now somebody else wants to work on the same application. So how can we work in a shared environment with the developer's version to download? He has to download or see drive, set, how it works.
That when you looked at kind of how I had my development environment set up, I had the Web AppBuilder installed in my source code directory. I just didn't version control it. So all the widgets are in version control. Each developer can then go install that developer edition of Web AppBuilder and develop against it. The team that we have right now, we've got about 8 developers actively working on Web AppBuilder applications, and that's how we do it too.
So you each have your own version of the actual Web AppBuilder developer edition.
Yep, and it's all locally on our machine. We develop it all locally.
I think it depends a little bit on kind of how your developers want to work with the application. What I showed in the beginning was about how do you deploy one version of the developer edition that everybody uses. If you're doing a lot of just building custom apps through that, and you maybe have 2 developers that are doing the widget work and 5 people that are building apps, it might make more sense to have a shared environment because most of the users aren't actually touching the widgets. They just want to see them and put them in the map and use that. So I think as Nick's saying, when you get past a couple people and your developers are more familiar with the actual tools, they may prefer to have their own copy and just share the source control for those widgets because they can then very easily pull the latest from a repository and have either an entirely new widget that Nick's built in the last week or updates to one that they're working on as well.
I'm thinking when we build the application, download it in a zip folder.
Right.
Keep it zip somewhere, then unzip it and upload it on the server. So if we have to update the same application, we take the zip.
Yeah, you basically would redeploy that same package. So the 2 different ways of doing it are, again, if you're using the source control method, you could then only deploy the widget change. rather than the entire app, you could just deploy the widget code itself, and the rest might stay the same.
I want to know more about source control.
Yeah, I'd say come up afterwards and Nick can show you what he's doing. Yeah, yeah.
Is there any way on that landing page to have it show all apps? What happens if a bunch of people are sharing a web app builder? I can't see somebody else's apps.
You mean on this landing page after I
Yeah.
log in?
Yeah.
I don't know offhand. Come up afterwards, we'll take a look.
Is that, in an enterprise deployment, that's kind of a big issue, right? 'Cause
It depends if you want people to see apps while you're building them versus after they're deployed. I would say usually if you want other developers to see them, then I would totally agree. For most users, you'd be deploying them somewhere else, and then they would see either a directory with links to them, or something more like a group in your portal that has all the thumbnails to point to those. But yeah, for developers, I can totally see that. Anything else? All right, again, feel free to come up, give us your card, we'll give you some slides, or you can get them afterwards and ask further questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody.